Welcome to Caring for Kids, where we discuss physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of children in a positive, loving environment that promotes good decision-making. We believe in parental responsibilities and setting an example that will guide your children along life's journey. We want to raise the issues that matter to parents and children alike. Now here's your host, Carl Krebs.
Welcome back. It's November 7th, 2 days after a momentous event occurred in the United States. And we're not going to talk politics, but we are going to talk about perhaps the ramifications of a change in leadership in the United States. And joining me right now is Jon Uhler, who's a licensed professional counselor and has a really good eye on what's happening with our kids in the United States. Jon, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the show.
Carl, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You know, I've heard a lot about you and what you're trying to do. And my question to you is, as you look at the change in what's going to be happening as we transition from this Biden administration into the second Trump administration, what do you see as a glimmer of hope in your struggle to help our children, to preserve our children, to protect our children from what is an imminent threat within our own school systems, within our libraries, within everything that our children touch and that touches our children? What's your biggest concern right now as a licensed professional counselor dealing in sexual trauma as well? So you've got quite a resume as I was reading up on you.
Yeah, and again, thank you for having me. I think there's hope. Right, that common sense and empowering parents is now going to happen. It was happening before the Biden administration because you have a very different philosophy, right? And you all in Canada, really around the world, there's a couple of things that are very clear. Either people care about protecting kids, vulnerable women and children, or they don't. And you're going to see that on a national level. You'll see that in terms of the policies that are implemented, or on a personal level, or on an individual level, you'll see how people approach safeguarding. And when it comes to education, or those involved in education, my greatest concern, and hopefully this will help open eyes, is we'll talk about the trans movement in a moment, which is the world's greatest lie, scam, and scheme ever foisted upon vulnerable children and their parents. And I can tell you why I can say that. But the reality is this: if somebody doesn't understand what the trans movement is, and there's been 20 years worth of brainwashing, quite frankly, 20 years worth of this script. So now the average person thinks the term trans is real. And you can even be fined if you don't use, especially in Canada, right? And we have a program.
That is correct. Bill C4 is a real.
There you go. And I actually submitted a brief testimony cautioning against that bill. The reason being is, if you care about the protection of kids, then you have to be able to see and understand that there are those that are very interested in, now whatever term you want to use, a predator, a psychopath, sociopath, manipulator, cult leader. There are people that are interested in taking advantage of or exploiting kids. Always have been, always will be, including women. So women and children generally are vulnerable. I'm not saying they are weaker than, but that's where we men need to be able to step up and be that protection for our families, for our wives and children, and not just physically, but also emotionally. There are people that are selfish and looking to take advantage of other people, and the most vulnerable among us are our kids. And so you have people that are looking to take advantage of kids in a lot of different ways, but especially you can do so financially, you can do so emotionally, and if you're doing so emotionally, it's either for financial or personal gain, and personal gains eventually is going to be sexual for those that are going to manipulate. So the greatest concern I have about the so-called trans movement, and we'll tell you why that's a misnomer in a moment, but the greatest concern is this: those that deal with kids on a regular and consistent basis, so that would have to do with all school personnel, medical personnel, if you are in law enforcement, anytime, if you are a pastor, if you're clergy, anytime you have, if you're in athletics, and you're dealing with kids, you are a mandated reporter. What that means is this. You are mandated. It's not an option. You are required by law. If you suspect, fortunately, you don't have to investigate, but if you suspect that a child is being abused, and there's a couple different types of abuse, of course, we understand physical, emotional, but sexual. If you suspect a child is being sexually abused, you must, under the penalty of civil and or criminal sanctions, you must report that. And so the question is this: are you able to identify, since you're required to, are you able to identify the primary red flag indicators? There are at least 9. There's probably about 27, quite frankly. And if you go to unmaskingthetransmovement.com, all one word scrunched together, and especially the YouTube channel, we did an extensive series on breaking down what are those red flag indicators. And unfortunately, the trans movement, those that have pushed this, the radicals, and it happens to coincide with the radical LGBTQ, right? And the one thing that ultimately this comes down to is those that are very interested in lowering the age of consent. I would call them pedophiles. If people don't like that term, now they're trying to rebrand that term as MAPS, minor attracted person. Whenever you hear somebody floating the term mature minor, you should be aware that somebody is trying to reframe that child so that they can take advantage of that child. Bodily autonomy. We started to hear that through COVID. So there are 2 terms now that are being floated by those that are interested in lowering safeguarding on the part of kids: bodily autonomy and mature minor. So if you hear anybody using those terms, you'd better be very careful. But the question and the challenge for anyone that's in charge of safeguarding kids is, would you know if a child is being perpetrated upon, if a child's being perped on, would you know the indicators? Because there's about 9 key red flag indicators. And if you have bought into this gender affirming approach, what'll happen automatically is you will reinterpret the red flags of sexual abuse into, or you'll reinterpret that as gender-related issues, and you will suggest they go off to a gender clinic. And then what you've done is you've added insult to injury, and you have consigned that child as they grow to have trauma upon trauma. And now you've taken an abused child, you've taken a child that's been injured, and now you've added additional complications such as sterilization, because if you get them on puberty blockers within a very short period of time, couple of months, guaranteed they will be sterilized. And then you're going to chop off
Jon,
body parts.
If I could just retrace that term you said, mature minor. It's so illogical, perhaps in some ways, because let's say my child, your child, comes to you and says, "Dad, I want the keys to the car." And you look at him and says, "Son, you're 12 years old." "Well, but Dad, I'm mature. Haven't I shown you that I'm mature? Look at the things I do around here. You asked me to take the garbage out. I take the garbage out. I get the cans to the end of the driveway, bring them back." You know, when we look at that, where's the limit on that when we say mature minor? Are we going down such a rabbit hole that we'll never get out of? Because I agree that there are huge concerns when we lower the age of consent and we edify a condition of the mind that previously was thought to be a psychosis of some kind.
And it's actually, I would be so bold to say it's not a condition of the mind. Okay, it's an issue, but it's an issue that's been brought about through a combination of a couple of things. One is normal adolescence. Nobody likes adolescence. We all went through it. It's uncomfortable. It's disconcerting. We all go through that. That's bad enough. But if you add on top of it somebody that wants to create a bigger issue than necessary within the mind of that child, all it's going to take is somebody from the outside to begin to stir the pot, begin to poke the festering wounds, as it were, the angst of adolescence. And you begin to suggest and implant thoughts and then sexualize the children, those minors. Now you've created a number of different things that will converge, and now you can manipulate a child down a certain path. What parents need to know is when you hear the term trans movement, you need to picture a moving sidewalk. Okay? Whenever you hear this term, trans movement, picture a moving sidewalk, and at any point, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, the trans movement is moving somewhere, and guaranteed the end of it. It will dump your child out on a surgeon's gurney, and they will have body parts removed, they'll have their sex organs removed, and they'll be a big pharma client for life, and they'll be emotionally screwed up, and they will be an easy target for sexual predators, 100% guaranteed.
I want to ask you a question here, Jon. Why is it that the first option seems to be gender reassignment? Why is it that when the child expresses a discomfort, of perhaps believing that they're in the wrong body, that somehow God made a mistake and I should be in a girl's body and vice versa, why is it that it's the medical option that they go to right away? In your opinion, why is that?
You're dealing with financial and sexual predators.
The sexual reassignment industry, that portion of what we call the medical community, is worth an awful lot of money, isn't it, Jon?
It's big money. I have some slides if this is appropriate, and if we can, if not, people can look up the amount of money. This is now called an industry. And what I want people to understand is prior to the year 2005, so my background was, among other things, working with survivors and then also sex offenders for 15 years. But during that time, also worked with kids in the system. The exact kind of kids that transition are the kids that I used to work with. Even had a group home with teen girls. Okay. Prior to the year 2005, myself and my colleagues, and in the field of mental health, psychology, whatever term you want to use, those of us that deal with people on a professional basis, there were 0 cases. It had never been heard of. Never in any of the graduate college textbooks. 0. Why? It didn't exist. Why? Nobody had thought it up. Why? Because nobody had sat around a table, so to speak, and tried to figure out, how can we pull a fast one? How can we pull, in a way, pull the perfect crime? Now, let me qualify that. Who's interested in this? You've got a number of very dark, what I call dark special interests, each with their own interests, but they come together and they converge like jackals on a carcass. And the one thing they're interested in is making sure that there are no boundaries that will protect these kids. So you have big pharma, you have the banks, there's a lot of money to be made in this. You have big medical, as it were. You have those in the alternative lifestyles that are interested in grooming kids. You have education. You have Planned Parenthood. There's big money in that. Why? Because they're one of the largest purveyors now of puberty blockers, which is interesting. They used to be for women, but now they've left women in the dust, and now they are pro getting men into women's spaces, because if you're going to do a sex change on a guy, guess where he's going to go? And then you have, again, additional other dark special interests. The ones I'm most concerned are those that are focusing on sexualizing kids. So that's everything from social media. You have OnlyFans. Of course, you have Playboy. You have Pornhub, which I think now had to get rid of about 93%, it's in the 90s, of all of their videos, because the facts are they were of minors underage. Okay, that's what happens when primarily the male mind goes deviant, and this is what's very important for parents and good people to understand.
You mentioned the porn industry, and boy, my mind is just fired up right now. We can recall certain nefarious characters that surface, serial killers, famous ones. Here's a story about Ted Bundy. People know Ted Bundy. Good-looking guy, could probably get any woman he wanted, but that wasn't his goal. In the final days of his life, he was incarcerated. He was facing the death penalty. He made one request, and that was to speak to Dr. Dobson of Focus on the Family. And that interview was so dark. And Dr. Dobson asked him, Ted, where did it start? He says it started with pornography, and then it just get worse. And I had to have a higher and higher dose, an inoculation that would take me to a new level. We've been playing with this for years, haven't we, Jon?
Right. As a matter of fact, without pornography and its influence in a lot of different ways that come at the kids, videos, online material, and then peers and other individuals. Without pornography, the trans movement fades away. It is a sexualization of kids. If you hear a child, and this is ubiquitous all throughout the internet, all throughout TikTok or the different online platforms, not so much TikTok, but some of the other ones. When the detransitioners, those kids that are detransitioning, coming out of this stupor, as it were, they'll inevitably talk in terms of some of the influences. And I have yet to find an exception. You'll eventually hear them say, well, I knew I was bi or bisexual when I was about age 10. Okay. As a mandated reporter, that should raise a red flag. That means we have a 10-year-old who says they're bisexual. What does that mean? Prior to the age of puberty, a child, unless influenced from the outside in, will not have a sexualized thought like adult sexuality. So that means what? You have, out of the mouth of these detransitioners, proof positive that somebody groomed and perped upon them.
You actually have a confession that
Absolutely.
You have a duty to act upon.
Absolutely you do. And that's why we need to be so concerned, because these red flag indicators, the very first one that anybody used to know is, let's say you're talking to a girl, let's say a teen girl, let's say either middle school, junior high, grade 7 or 8. And let's say this child says, and it could be younger, says, I hate being a girl, I wish I was a boy. What's the very first thing that used to and should come to our mind? This child's being perked on because the child thinks if I wasn't a girl, he wouldn't be touching me. But now what do we say? Oh, well, off to the clinic you go. And no child's going to come right out and say they're being perked on. They're going to drop hints. What are some of these hints? Well, these are the indicators. You're going to see statements such as that. You're going to see discomfort with their sexuality. So they want to cover up. You're going to see eating disorders. You're going to see self-harm. You're going to see anxiety, depression, what's called bipolar or manic depression. You're going to see mood changes. You're going to see personality changes, shall we say, and a lot of these, the more severe a kid has been perked on, there is what's called dissociation. A child will a young person will split off, as it were, will kind of go away on the inside. Well, part of them can come out, and as you're talking to that child, you won't know that you're talking to another part that actually may not identify with the same gender they are. So oftentimes these survivors have male parts. Well, if you're a male part, you come out in a female body, guess what? You don't identify with the body, and you don't want these breasts. So guess what you're going to be inclined to do? So these surgeons and these doctors that are working with these kids, they don't work with these young people, they will actively ignore scarring from self-injury. They'll ignore this. Well, that's you, and we're talking serious scarring. That is virtually 100% guaranteed sexual abuse. And to think that you take a sexual abuse victim and you don't ask about their history, you're just going to agree and affirm, and off to the doctor's office and surgeon's table you go. Now what have you done to that kid? Especially when they start to come, yeah, especially when they come out of that trauma. What I want your listeners, what I want parents and teachers and educators and pastors really need to get on board, because this is sucking in our kids. This is a cult. So every church should be discussing this. That prior to 2013, there was no ability to make a profit off of this. So if you look at, and you can just Google different stats, or you can go on to Unmasking the Trans Movement, and we will show some of these stats, especially what are the 9 red flag indicators. We just did that. I also have a couple different videos on my YouTube channel, Jon K. Uhler, that's John with no H, Jon K. Uhler LPC. A lot of information about survivors and the trans movement and predators. Prior to the year 2013, you couldn't make money off of slicing and dicing and sterilizing kids through pharmaceuticals and surgical measures. You couldn't bill for that. The thing that made it billable was the DSM-5. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual with all the mental health diagnoses. There was a change from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Once that happened, now it was very subjective. And prior to that, you had a DSM-4, then DSM-4 text revision, TR. It used to be that the only issue of gender confusion was young boys and when they were young. That's when we as therapists would see them. But then you went from the DSM-4 to DSM-4 TR, text revision, and suddenly it included adolescents. Well, that's a group of 13 individuals who decided to do that, and then DSM-5. It was the DSM-5 that made this billable. Without that,
and the numbers are shocking, because the numbers I've done in a brief amount of research could be as high as $4 billion.
Oh yeah,
these surgeries could easily, when you incorporate the pharmaceutical side of it and all of it, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I've read and listened to doctors who have opted out of the medical model because they realize that they're only dealing with symptoms. This child who comes in and says, I'm confused, is not being given the adequate time to adjust or the professional approach. Time is not a healer. It's a revealer. And if we give enough time to something and the proper safe context, could we not work with these kids before we tear their beautiful young bodies apart, that we can never put them back together?
That's right. Who benefits from having body parts whacked off? If anybody's watching, so here's the DSM-5. You can find it online, and what you will find is this: when this thing was published in 2013, around the world, especially all Western world countries, here in North America, in Europe, all countries around the world, you look at the rates of referrals. There were none. It was blipping up a little bit when you had RuPaul's Drag Race. That started some. As a matter of fact, that was a significant indicator. You had Bruce Jenner, who changed to Caitlyn. Yes. Okay, but when the DSM-5 was published, suddenly you could charge for those services, and everything skyrockets from there. So 12 people plus an editor, so 13 individuals, and I have challenged them publicly, that Blanchard and Zucker especially, who testified against C4, well, you know what? He's talking out of both sides of his mouth, because what he needs to come forward is saying, we blew it, we created a Frankenstein's monster that's harming people, we're sorry we did it, we're going to go back to the diagnosis of the DSM-4, and all of this thing, this entire gender industry, this entire trans movement, okay, and I should have added this, without the DSM-5 and porn, you have no trans movement. People need to understand.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because when you look at the numbers, and it seems to be consistent, I looked at them again just to see, is there any change? In boys, it's between 5 and 14 out of 100,000 kids. And in girls, it's less than that. It's around 3 out of 100,000 that say they're experiencing this sexual dysphoria. Those numbers are not a movement, John. It's a small sliver of the child that needs help, and they're crying out. And I truly believe you've hit the nail on the head, that they are being perpetrated upon, and we're not looking for those signs. We're rushing right past it and saying, you know what? Let's get them into the operating room.
That's right, and we don't want to believe that adults would be that way. Well, the same thing in Germany. How did Germany become Nazi Germany? Just a number of years and the human heart. Okay, nothing has changed with the human heart. And given the right conditions, greedy people will do what they will do. And we don't want to believe that there are unethical people within the medical field. Well, guess what? There's a lot of unethical doctors that are bottom line motivated. And so they see this as a cash cow, and they are cashing in. And it's sick. They don't care about the kids, because if they cared about the kids, you wouldn't chop off body parts and make them sterilized. That's not how you care about kids. You find out what the issue is. But now that's illegal in Canada. They call it conversion therapy. Do you know why? Because they've inverted the language. And the way to understand the term conversion therapy is this. Think about a cult that gets a hold of your child and sucks your child into the cult, the Moonies or Hare Krishnas or whatever cult, let's say. Let's say you want to get your kid out of the cult. The cult will tell you, hands off, you better not convert our child. They've taken control of your child.
Isolation.
So if you try to kill your child,
that child.
That's right. So they will accuse you of conversion therapy, because now the child's starting to think for him or herself, and they may have second thoughts because, gee, the child starts to realize, oh, do I really want my penis and breasts whacked off?
Yeah. You know, John, we're running out of time here. And in the couple of minutes we got left, we look back at Nazi Germany and the doctors that performed such horrific procedures on people. And we look at it with such disdain. And we're seeing it in front of our eyes, but it's being explained differently. Somehow there's a newer, better, clearer understanding that this is actually okay. When you look forward now, and again, returning to the beginning part, are you optimistic that with someone like Robert Kennedy, who's going to be given broad sweeping power in this administration, are you optimistic that we could turn this around in the United States? As a practitioner, what's your thought?
I'm very optimistic, and President Trump has said virtually on day one. So we're going to get rid of all this crap. We're going to get rid of all this ideology and go back to biology 101. We're going to stop unduly influencing kids. Schools are going to get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're not going to implant ideas, and they're not going to supplant the role of the parents. And schools never should have been involved in that. So I feel very, very hopeful that we're going to get rid of all this junk. We're going to get rid of men out of women's sports, men out of women's prisons, men out of women's locker rooms. We're going to keep perps and predators out of women's spaces.
You know, when he says common sense, isn't really all of what you just said fall under the bracket of common sense? You know, it's amazing. We're the most advanced, technologically advanced, country in the world. No society has lived at the level of technology, and yet we've become foolish in our ways to be duping ourselves. And, in some ways, it's a return to the gods of Baal. We're sacrificing our kids. And, I love that movie Freedom. And the line that comes out of it, our kids are not for sale, but they are for sale, John. They're being auctioned off in this sick game, as we could call it. So I want to thank you so much for spending time. And may I ask that we can have you back again? I love your candor, and we'll have time for those slides. And I'd like to get through the rest of the red flags.
Oh, there you go. I'd be happy to. And thank you for your work, Carl. You're doing a wonderful job.
Well, you know what? We're pulling together to get the truth out there. So thank you so much. Time is a precious commodity. Thank you for your time today. Have a good night.
You have a good evening.
All right. Well, you know what? We're definitely going to have Jon Uhler back. What a show. What a man who's speaking the truth. And what a thrill. And I want to thank my producer, Brad, for connecting me with him, because you were right. This guy speaks truth. He's not afraid. And I love the way he lands his punches. Solid body punches. So let me just say, guys, well, thank you so much. Things That Matter is exactly what you just witnessed here. We're talking about things that truly do matter to us. And my intention to go forward, working and bringing on the guests, and just to flesh out the story. I don't intend to be the story. I want to tell the story and get the experts to tell the story. That's how we're going to learn. That's how we're going to empower ourselves. That's how we're going to take back our schools and our systems that have been so compromised in this process. So come back next week. We're going to have more great guests on Things That Matter. We'll be back at our regular time of 6:30 Manitoba. As always, wherever you are, God bless you. Love each other. Stay true to what is true. And don't be deceived. We'll see you again next week here on Things That Matter. Good night.